Okay, so some weeks are busier than others. So we had some developments last week that I think a lot of you are probably interested in. You probably have heard. Hopefully you got the MEA alert, but if not, through the news. We had a couple of Supreme Court decisions come out recently in the last week since we were last together. So the two issues at this point, or the two decisions that we had in the last week. First, the OSHA ETS. We've been talking about the OSHA ETS since November. But just to clarify, it's the emergency temporary standard. It was the vaccine or test requirement for large employers. So it was going to apply to employers with over 100 employees. And it was going to either mandate vaccines or require testing, blocked by the Supreme Court in their decision last week. Most experts think that this is now dead. There is a small chance that it comes back to life because the Supreme Court doesn't have the final word on this right now. It goes back down to the Court of Appeals. There's a theoretical chance that the Court of Appeals lets it live, but no one really thinks that's going to happen. It's a very conservative Court of Appeals that it's going back to. There also is a chance that OSHA decides to make a permanent rule and go through the normal process to do that. Again, most of the experts that I'm hearing are saying that that's not likely to happen, but there is a chance. But for the most part right now, it looks like the OSHA ETS is dead. At the same time, the Supreme Court ruled that the vaccine mandate for healthcare workers does stay in effect or goes back into effect. So if you are a healthcare provider, if you get Medicare, Medicaid funding, this may apply to you. Otherwise, doesn't apply to you at all. So don't concern yourself with it. And then the vaccine contractor or the federal contractor vaccine mandate, currently on hold. We expect a decision on this later in the month. So stay tuned on that. As soon as something happens, I will let you know. This is the statement that U.S. Department of Labor Secretary Marty Walsh put on the OSHA website. I just copied and pasted it. You'll get the slides after today's webinar, so I'm not going to read it to you, but I do think there's a couple of things in here that do warrant mentioning. If you go down to the third paragraph, we urge all employers to require workers to get vaccinated or test weekly. Employers are responsible for the safety of their workers on the job, and OSHA has comprehensive COVID-19 guidelines to help them uphold their obligation. Keep in mind the general duty clause. So what OSHA is basically saying is, look, first of all, we think we had the right to implement the CTS. We're not going to give up on enforcing safety under COVID, but we're going to try to do it in other ways. From a practical point of view, do I think OSHA is going to come knocking on your door to find out what you're doing around safety and vaccines? No, unless you have a whistleblower in your midst. So we all do, as employers, have an obligation under the general duty clause to keep our workplaces safe. And that's going to mean different things in every workplace, right? It's going to mean one thing if you're a manufacturer with everybody in person and working in close quarters. It's going to mean something very different to a hybrid workforce or to a fully remote workforce. But it's something that, as much as we'd like to stop thinking about COVID, we really need to continue to think about the safety aspects, and that falls largely on HR. So what to think about now? I've been saying, ever since the vaccines became available, I think it's a really great idea to determine the vaccination status of each employee and get proof of vaccination. The easiest way to do that is to get copies of cards. You're allowed to do that. Just have to keep the cards confidential as a medical record. But I think it becomes really important to understand your risk, but it also can become important in the quarantine type scenarios if someone has an exposure. And I'll talk about that again in a minute. And then it sort of comes back to a question, are we back to carrots and sticks? Is now the time to still implement your own vaccine mandate? Different large and small employers are taking different approaches on this. For the two that I saw yesterday in the news, Honeywell is still moving forward with its vaccine mandate. GE is not, they're dropping it. You need to make that decision for your own workplace. Doesn't make any sense. Even though the Supreme Court has said the federal government can't do this large employer vaccine mandate, for the most part, private employers who have tried to do a vaccine mandate, those lawsuits have gone in favor of the private employers. You have a health and safety right, to do what's best for your business. There are a couple of states that have said no vaccine mandates, but unless you're in one of those states, you can do this if that's a decision you need to make. The one thing to remember is you've got to have in your policy the allowance for reasonable accommodation for disability and religious reasons. Doesn't mean you have to grant the accommodation, but does mean you need to go through the reasonable accommodation process, just as you would for any other request for disability reasonable accommodation or religious reasonable accommodation. And again, if you want to talk that through with an employment attorney, if you're a member, we can talk that through as part of your membership. But it really is a relatively easy process. We have several members who have implemented vaccine mandates and are on the other side of them now. So something to think about. What about requiring boosters? I think if you're going to require vaccines, it probably makes sense to go ahead and require boosters. Fully vaccinated, the definition from CDC still is just 1 shot of J&J or 2 shots of Moderna or Pfizer. But I think if you're going to go ahead and require vaccines as an employer, why not go ahead and require boosters as well? But again, if we're not having a mandate, I think we are a little bit back to carrot and sticks. Encourage vaccination, do whatever you can. Do you go back to educating your employees? Do you go back to giving some sort of incentive? Consider a written vaccination policy. If you're an MEA member, we do have them in the Coronavirus Resource Center in the member portal. I think it's a good idea, even if it's just to say, we're not requiring them, but we strongly encourage them. I think it's good to have a policy to point to. And then one of the things that the ETS was going to do was give employees of large employers time off to get vaccinated and time to recover from vaccines. That was something that FFCRA had done previously. So at this point, in most places, employees don't have those rights. Something to consider. It's going to be a lot easier for employees to get vaccinated if they have time off to get the shot. The ETS had said 4 hours was a reasonable amount of time. And also there is a big concern with what if I have a reaction? Again, ETS had said 2 days was a reasonable amount of time to recover. So think about putting that into any type of a policy. At the same time, when we're talking about safety, you got to talk about masks. What we saw in last week's webinar is we did a poll and we compared poll results from a few months ago to now. We have more employers, at least who attend our webinars, doing masking now than we did a few months ago back before the current surge. So think about, should you be having masking in the workplace? If you're going to do masks, it should be everyone, not just the unvaccinated. That's what CDC says. It may just be in public spaces. It may just be in places where people can't socially distance, but it is something to think about. Every workplace is going to be a little bit different. I think if you're going to do it, you're going to make it mandatory, not voluntary. And if your employees are going to do it, your visitors are going to do it too. But the things to think about are your population density, interaction with the public, and that going back to that question of how many people are vaccinated. And or whether you're requiring regular testing. And one of the questions we do get a lot, and I know we got this last week on the webinar, I went back and looked at the comments. What about those employees who refuse to wear their masks or refuse to wear them correctly? And it's exhausting, I know, for supervisors, and it's exhausting for HR to be the mask police. And you have some employees who just aren't really going to wear them or not going to wear them properly. They're always going to slip below the noses. They're going to end up on the chins. And that's just a decision you have to make as an employer. Because one of the problems is you don't want to discipline and ultimately terminate someone necessarily for mask usage when it is so hard right now to recruit and retain people. So it is something to think about. I think you make a philosophical decision at the top. What are we going to do about this? And then you stick to it. And as we all know, basic HR discrimination law consistency is really, really important. So with ETS going away, it's also something to think about. Should we be doing any type of testing at all? Should we be doing regular testing for everyone? Should we be doing it just for unvaccinated employees? Maybe we have employees who travel. Maybe we should be testing them before they go and when they come back. And then we can think about the different types of testing. It has been a little bit harder to access testing, but I think the supply chain's loosening up a little bit about that. There was a huge rush right after the holidays for people wanting to get tested. Do you think about self-testing? Do you think about the home kits? And how do you trust people when they give you the results on that? It kind of harkens back to when we were taking temperatures. Do we let employees take temperatures and take the picture and send it to us in the via email or via text? do we want to do the same thing for the self-testing? Because how do we trust that people actually took the sample correctly, read it correctly, et cetera? And of course, who pays for the testing and who pays for the time spent testing? Who pays for the testing really is a matter of state law. And there are state laws in Pennsylvania, New Jersey that at least suggest that employers should be paying for the testing. I think that will be the subject of lawsuits going forward. Who pays for the time spent testing? You have non-exempt employees, you're requiring the tests. I think that you're paying for that time. There will be lawsuits around that. Speaking of lawsuits, I mentioned this last week, but I think it bears repeating. A lot of the large international law firms are tracking this, but Littler is saying that since March of 2020, there have been almost 5,000 lawsuits filed against employers, labor and employment related, directly related to the pandemic, and that's nationwide. But the most filings, not surprising California, not surprising New York, but New Jersey and Pennsylvania are at the top of that list as well. So something to think about. And over 2,500 of these cases include a claim for retaliation. Not surprising, over 50% of all charges filed with the EEOC every year have a retaliation component. So not surprising that when we're talking about COVID, we get the same thing as well. Remember, this could be an ADA issue. COVID or the long haul effects of COVID can be a disability, and always think, no matter what policy you're implementing, think about those reasonable accommodation concerns. And so I know we're running over time, and I've covered this slide a few times now, but I like to include it because I think it's a great, easy reference for you. You guys are going to get the email afterward with the slides. This is the guidance on isolation. This is the guidance on quarantine following exposure. And keep in mind that the guidelines are different depending on whether your employees are vaccinated or unvaccinated. And that's one of the several reasons I think it's really important to be tracking employee vaccinations. One more thing to stop the spread, you need to think about, what are you doing around PTO? How are we encouraging sick employees to stay home? Is their time off paid or unpaid? Do we expand PTO? Require a negative test to return? Probably not. CDC says you can test positive for weeks after your original positive test. We require a doctor's note to return? Probably not. Not always easy for folks to get in to see their physicians, and physicians can't always, other than following CDC guidance, physicians can't always tell whether, just by examining somebody, if they're going to be safe to go back in the workplace or not. All right, Kevin, what did we get in terms of questions?
Cover most of the questions. Since we're running late, we'll kind of, someone said, is there a list of states that require to pay the mandatory testing? I don't recall us saying that before.
I've never seen a list. As I said, there a couple of states always come up during the discussion. California and Illinois require the payment of employee expenses. And so the thought process is that those are two states that you almost definitely would need to pay for the testing. Pennsylvania's statute is pretty ambiguous, and New Jersey has a statute as well.
Okay, and I think we've covered most everything else. If you're a member, and again, we went a little bit long today. Mike did a great job, but we went a little long. So if you're a member and have questions that we didn't cover, please give a call to the hotline, and we'll of course cover this again next week too, so we can catch it then. We did post into the community a question about, if you all want to participate, what are you doing for well-being programs? I think the concept of well-being is so important. So if you want to go there and share what your company is doing, that would be great.